Ong Wajini Dini Sam Pema Gesa Dombolo Yazan Jaki Pema Jini Jesa Drang Dekado Mamboko Titi Jesa Damduji Jinjin Jiji So Guru Pema Sede Hong Om Ahum Benza Guru Pema Sede Hong Om Ahum Benza Guru Pema Sede Hong Om Ahum Benza Guru Pema Sede Hong. Rousing our bodhicitta, heart mind of enlightenment, so that this reflection time together becomes like the perfect conditions for the Buddha nature, the natural intelligence, love, compassion, and wisdom of every being to arise just spontaneously, naturally, effortlessly, and for awakening to happen for all beings. Thought to offer a brief reflection on something that's very special and tender-hearted and kind of really super relevant for myself as a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner. And that's this kind of like inquiry or exploration into multiple worlds and multiple beings and multiple modes of being. That the kind of question is like, what does it mean to like try to be a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner who like doesn't believe in the six realms? That they're just only like mental psychological projections. Because the Buddha taught in all levels of teaching, Theravada, Sutra Mahayana, Tantra Mahayana, Dzogchen, these different beings, like six realms of beings: hell beings, hungry ghosts, animals, humans, asura warring gods, form and formless gods. And just to taught this in all the teachings, there were always these cosmology kind of frames of beings in different worlds with different bodies and different lifespans and interests and values and abilities. The richness of the worlds that the Buddha always included in his teachings. Like what does it mean as a Tibetan Buddhist to just not believe in any of that as having any ontological reality? As if it's just metaphor about like mental states, like such that like the hell realm and hell beings is just like a metaphor for what it's like when I'm overwhelmed by hatred and I'm like burning on fire with kind of like that emotional landscape. I don't know, I think this is very dangerous. To not be willing to open-mindedly entertain the possibility of other more than human beings, of other world systems, of other worlds. To like basically say as Buddhists, like now I can accept the rational, the empirical, verifiable aspects of Buddha teaching, and all the other kind of more metaphoric or stories, narratives, kind of that was all like for like less mature approaches or for pre-modern approaches. For beings that weren't yet available to just be like work with the actual factual reality. They had to like work with all these childish, superstitious projections. Because I think that like that kind of more extractive, um, kind of European, quantifiable, empirical, rational only approach is really, really dangerous to take to Buddhism. If you're really trying to follow the teachings of the Buddha, like the fullness of like following in the footsteps of the Buddha. Because the Buddha always taught like with context. Like the Buddha always offered a technique or a philosophical explanation like in response to a context of like the beings he was with and the minds of those beings, their dispositions and readinesses, their bodies, their sense making, the problems they were facing. Like the way that their kind of like their arrangement of causes and conditions and effects actually was, instancing as a world in a world with others. And then a teaching would arise in response to those conditions. The Buddha never just like, I mean, the Buddha didn't just say this is the one, essence principle and like it doesn't matter about the context. Just decontextualize this principle and plug it and play it wherever you want. The Buddha always said context mattered. Like had this very rich, real, like fully embodied, like postmodern, healthy inclusivity. Context matters. It depends. Causes and conditions and effects always matter. It's not just extracting the essence and decontextualizing it as if the body and the world didn't matter. Why is this relevant for Buddhists? Because this kind of approach always assumes a story or a world as being given. There's a set of assumptions that are given. In more scientific materialist circles, like where we assume some kind of a metaphysical realism, like that human sense making is like this given way of knowing, and the world as we see it is kind of like the real world, and that basically like there's this myth of the given that like as long as like we attune our instruments or human instruments to this given world, like attuning them accurately is called valid knowledge or like truth. That's just assumptions. We're assuming the myth of a given. We're assuming our sense making. We're assuming the human embodiment is the like instrument. We're assuming like a certain way that the human instrument is functioning as being a normalized way. Those are all just assumptions. Metaphysical realism is assumptions. Just because assumptions are trending or like theories are certain kind of like have more wide consensual agreement currently, it doesn't mean they're ontologically true. I mean, this is kind of like so kind of like obvious to it's almost like absurd to say it. But like just because like, science is so powerful, physics, chemistry, biology, astrophysics, neuropsychology, like just because they're getting a lot of funding and are very powerful and we can, build just these giant buildings and terraform kind of anything we want and we're going, off planet exploration. It doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's powerful and that there's a lot of consensual support around it currently. It's like science kind of like mocks itself every 100 years in the past. Like, look at us. Look at what we believed in 100 years ago. We were so like pre-scientific then. And even that similar, like that kind of more like kind of quantifiable only approach, like that kind of unhealthy modernist hyper rational approach, like it's like erased like so much of the cultural nuance and like embodied world systems of so many different cultures, like continents worldwide, like tens of thousands of years of humans have believed in animist more than human beings like populating these worlds that we're a part of. It's such a new idea to like have a non-animate normative way of sense making. It's like 200-300 years old, based in Europe. Like, and there's valuable aspects of that model, the scientific like materialist model, because literacy and longevity and human rights and these things that are very valuable, important aspects, that now we kind of assume as givens, like because like they're just so wonderful to assume, like to get an extra 10 years to be alive. It's like wonderful and like equal rights for kids. And I mean, there's just so much benefit that those ideas have brought. But it's also in the wake of like a post-apocalyptic fervor that's kind of crusaded itself across like all the continents and like basically destroyed all these animist traditions as if they were all pre-scientific, superstitious, hocus pocus, mumbo jumbo, immature, childish projection. So what does it do if we take that approach to a system as robust as like Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism? We have this commonly assumed default narrative of like the world I see and my human body and what is like, the world that I'm a part of. Basically, I take Buddhism as a set of like techniques to then work in this assumed world with kind of the narratives I'm assuming. And like I optimize that way of functioning to have like a happier me in that world or like a more aligned sense making in that world. But it's not willing to like really undo the rigidity or the fixity around the world that I'm assuming, my sense making, the world that I'm co-creating, the assumptions that I'm holding. It's like trying to do Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana practice without taking a middle way Madhyamaka approach, where you're really trying to undo extreme views, this dogmatic fundamentalist approach to like, this world is the world, my way is the way. My body is the normative way to determine what is a body and what is sense making, what is logic and what is the correct pattern. and what is the right life, and what is the one true path. Like, middle way Buddhism is designed to uproot and loosen those mistaken habits, those mistaken, reified, calcified, rigid, freeze-framing, fundamentalist habits. Sutra Mahayana it's like all lines up to like uproot the myth of the given. My world making, my logic only, my story is like foundational. Saying my story, it's a story, it's all dreamlike, but it's not really so much arguing in like this dream is better than that dream or the only dream, you know? It's more like pointing us towards like being able to embody multiple dreams, multiple stories, multiple languages, multiple logics, kindly, carefully, full of care, full of precision and thoroughness, a rigor. So that when we play the different varieties of games and we use different knowledge sets and different language systems, we experience other people's emotional terrains and our own. We experience ourselves as more fully embodied, rich beings with like a rich past and a rich kind of a rich being. That we can like embrace the fullness like more comprehensively and more elegantly and more accurately. So that these parts of ourselves we really haven't tapped into at all, like the sacred parts or the pure parts, this tantric elements, where we're not assuming a fixed given duality mode, where we're trying to actually have like our wisdom capacities come on, our more than propositional ways of knowing turn on and be embraced, our participatory ways and perspectival shifting ways and like these procedural skillful like ways of elegantly dancing in the world, like in a multiplicis and like with a multi kind of like functional elegant, you know, creative splash. Like tantra is like a full embrace of the richness. Not so it can be decoherent and make no sense and just be jumbled or some heap of a mess, but so it can like work with a lot of different bodies and a lot of stories and human ones and non-human ones, Gandharva ones and enlightened Buddha ones and yogini ones and full retinue ones. That's the whole practice of Tibetan Buddhist like sadhana practice, is a training in how we can like literally viscerally in an embodied enacted way like take on different bodies and with 2 arms and 4 arms and 1,000 arms and eyes and like wrathful versions and semi-wrathful ones and peaceful ones and these worlds. And we can do activities like with light, and we can receive all the blessings of the Buddhas in an instant and be the size of a mustard seed and be the size of a mountain and then just like instantly dissolve into just open awareness space and then recohere into different bodies and to like be embodiment as sound. Like this is just like so richly like the living, breathing practice of Tibetan Buddhism. To be willing to entertain multi-bodies, multi-world systems, multimodal ways of being. It's like such a part of Vajrayana Buddhism. So like to assume this one human, empirical, rational only way has to be this unquestionable given, it really makes no sense. Like it makes no sense as a Tibetan Buddhist to hold that kind of a view. Especially when like you go to Tibetan Buddhist gombas, nunneries, monasteries, and they're like, you know, at Padmasambhya Ling, we're doing an hour and a half of Dharmapala practice like every night, Dharma protector practice, where we're honoring these actual more than beings, like these beings' commitments to Guru Padmasambhava in an actual literal historical, you know, time and space in the past, that they committed to use their activities, their abilities to support the Dharma in a variety of very specific ways. And every day we're making offerings to them and we're asking them to renew their commitment. We're still interested. We still value the Dharma. We still want to practice. We still want to learn more. We still want to be more capable of serving beings in the teachings. Please uphold your vow to Guru Rinpoche. It's like a daily thing of any actual living community of Tibetan Buddhism. That's not just like a book reading Buddhism. It's actually embodied people like in spaces together, sharing meals and cleaning up and practicing and setting up a puja and being humans together and making mistakes and forgiving and like grieving together. and celebrating and having picnics and parties and just like we're actually being fully embodied human beings together, which the richness of our multi-enfolded embodiment, we're like honoring the richness, like practically in practice, like practically in community, practically in our study of like these internested philosophical systems. Vaibhashika, into Sartrantika, into mind only, into middle way Vajrayana, into outer tantra, into inner tantra, into inner highermost unexcelled inner tantra, Vajrayana, Mahasandhi, like Dzogchen, Mahamudra, all that. These are all internested, layered embodiments, world making, world shaping, world co-creative enactment that is like a living Buddhism. That's not this one way only to do Buddhism. It's this multifold way to be fully, richly, radiantly embracive of relative truth and to recognize it's all absolutely open and empty, free of fixation, free of singularity, independence, and permanence. It's non-reifying richness. This is Tibetan Buddhism. This is Sutra Mahayana. This is Theravada. The Buddha taught Theravada, like in Theravada, like 6 realms and these supercognitive abilities and past and future lives and just like all this way out of the box stuff. The like living, breathing life of it, the cosmology of it, the relationships of it, of like actually being a Buddhist. Not just like extracting a set of techniques like mindfulness out of its context of these interwoven eightfold noble path, just like grabbing one of the strings, like the mindfulness, right mindfulness, as if that's the fullness of Buddha's teaching. No, it was like this intertwining 8 limbs or these 8 threads that made up a solid cord that was like the Buddha's path. It was this integrity of like this ecology of all these factors coming together to have this like counteractive dynamical system that like the ego couldn't just like grab one part of it and get total control, because there are all these counteracting dynamical forces that was like actually being a part of a living system. Having your mind have its richness as a living dynamical system, be in a world that's a living dynamical system with other minds that are living dynamical systems that create an actual living adaptive responsive ecology, which is called Buddhism. Buddhism's a religion, and it's an art, and it's poetry, and it's science, and it's logic, and it's practice, and it's a way of life, and this pithy and active like simplicity within complexity like points. It's all of these things. The Buddha taught all of these things in coherent fashions, depending on what was helpful in a given context. So to like take a strictly like empirical rational only approach, as if Buddhism is just what's in my mind. It's this psychologization of Buddhism. Like it just matters what my mind is doing because it's all just my emotional states. And like the hell realm is an emotional state and the God realm is an emotional state. Yes, that's one way that's one thread of meaning of these teachings of the 6 realms. That's a valid thread of meaning. But like the hell realm, if it's just as empty as the human realm is just as much a story as the hell realm. It's just as metaphorical. It just happens to be a metaphor that all these humans believe in. And they all agree to this story, and so then they believe it as a given truth of ontological reality, like a metaphysical given or realism. But it just happens to be a consensual story that like we share with each other. Like current trending scientific models. Like it's all like when we're in the club and invited to parties and get the funding, like yeah, it all seems really real and true until it's overturned in 100 years, or you know, it's accelerating like how fast things are being replaced now. Like some updates. But it's just temporarily true. The Buddha taught this at all the levels of the teaching too. Dreamlike, pointing towards the absolute nature, the dreamlike nature of all relative conditions. They keep changing. That's why in the middle way Yamaka approach, we're not really arguing so much on the specifics of the story or the game or the logic, the dream. We're trying to recognize its dreamlike nature so that we can play that game or dream more skillfully, like so that it's good for both you and me. It's mutually uplifting, or omni-win, benefit of self and other. Buddha is not trying to erase the dream. He says the dream's unraced. It cannot be erased. The point isn't to erase relative truth. From middle way Madhyamaka up, relative truth is just as equally important as absolute truth. They're aspects of the same. The openness of reality always expresses itself relationally. The relational kind of like interactivity is always free of any fixed permanent structuration. It's always relative and absolute in union and balance. There's no longer a one-upsmanship from middle way Madhyamaka on into Tantra and Dzogchen. We're naturally embracing both. Formless, semi-form, form. Body, speech, and mind. It's a full package Buddhism. Like we have all these internested layers of yanas. Not just one way of being embodied, one way of being in a world, one system of knowledge, one way of sense making. It's multifold now. We use Vaibhashika, we use Raitantrika, we use mind only, we use middle way, we use outer tantras and inner tantras in these larger comprehensive wholes. These greater, richer stories that include the sub-stories and the subplots. They're symphonies of meaning and enactment. Not just random decoherent patterns of just mashups. Elegant patterned worlds that respect with nuance and amazing immense clarity cause, condition, and effect. And we're learning to move between them, between the worlds, and to with accountability to live within them and to hold ourselves responsible in certain games and certain worlds or dreams, but without believing it's more than a dream. That's the absolute side. But really showing up with detail to the contextual, tenor, flavor, theme of that dream. That's karma. So we're always honoring the relative and the absolute. And to just assume the human way is the way, that's the given. Scientific materialist way is the way, that's the given. It's just another kind of an ism, a dogmatism, a fundamentalism. And logic is valuable and important. But Buddhism was really so thorough on this. There's amongst duality beings, sentient beings, there's invalid cognition and valid cognition. And then amongst noble awakened beings, there's yogic direct valid cognition. So invalid duality cognition is a hallucination. It's a concept that doesn't actually have a referent in the world anywhere. Like the child of a barren woman. It's an idea that doesn't actually have a referent anywhere in reality. The ego is said to be a total hallucination. It's an idea that makes sense as an idea, but there's no actual thing or entity in the world that it actually refers to that's actually there. It's just a completely mistaken perception. And then there's a valid cognition amongst consensual truth, amongst human beings with certain operating sense doors, we'll see things like H2O and gravity, pulling mass inward, and table. I mean, just all the kind of math working. Consensual valid cognition, but it assumes a flat linear space, flat space, curved space. Then there's the nuance between the games, between which group we're a part of, what game we're playing, what are the given assumptions of that group or that set. And so the rules shift according to those given assumptions or the context. That's called valid cognition. But this is again amongst duality beings because we're holding the games as being somewhat of a system of real ontological, epistemological truth that we're not really seeing yet, that the game is a game, or our way of mapping or modeling is actually just a representation of reality. But that at a point of yogic valid cognition, where Aryas that actually see the dreamlike nature, the absolute nature of all of these experiences we have, for this direct yogic valid cognition, they're no longer relying on inference and deduction or indirect valid cognition. They're just having direct valid cognition, which so it doesn't filter itself through a dualistic modeling system that's exclusivist, that has an edge, and beyond that edge it doesn't know, and so it kind of like blatantly fills in the gaps. That doesn't do that. So direct valid cognition has these more than propositional ways of knowing, these like additional variety of intelligences that aren't using deductive inference, or not using deduction or induction. It's just direct valid cognition. This is like yogis. And this is in Theravada Buddhism, Sutra Mahayana Buddhism, Tantra Mahayana Buddhism. So amongst the duality sentient minds, we need to do the valid kind of valid cognition, like games that are actually coherent, that actually have games that we can play with others, dreams that are actually like patterned. It's not just total hallucination, like we're talking about, whatever, Succession or Game of Thrones or some just totally fictitious worlds that don't have actual physical representation aside from just some actors in a studio, But I mean, like, it's not really there in reality. So we're talking about coherent, valid cognitions, like sets of worlds, humans and squirrels and Gandharvas and Rakshas and hell beings and pretas and all that. If you're a Buddhist and believe in these kind of other games that are possible to be played, that are being played by actual beings or minds. And then there's the direct yogic valid cognition. They can start to see these other more nuanced pattern games. And then there's the even deeper, like Tantra approach, where they're not using any kind of a duality holding system at all. It's not just more refined relative truth where you can see more subtle sentient enactment, like subtle, like a greater variety of sentient embodiment and worlds, like six realms of beings. You're actually seeing in a way that doesn't assume any of the duality fixation of any of those six classes of beings. And so you're really kind of like on the bhumis, bodhisattva levels at that point. So how do enlightened beings like just relate to each other without having to dumb anything down? This is like pure direct valid cognition. So the Buddha mapped these things out, and it never said at any time does the game stop or the dream stop. The Buddha taught this pattern has been happening since beginningless time. It'll continue since endless time, till endless time. The Buddha refuted in certain philosophical views that time is even there. Is Vaibhashika view to assume irreducible particles of space and time and mind. That's a certain philosophical worldview in Buddhism that's then later refuted by Buddha's teachings. Mind-only school refutes the idea that there's irreducible particles of time and space. It says no, it's just mind. Madhyamaka then refutes that they're irreducible particles of mind. That's actually just another game, another temporary holding pattern. But in all cases, there's always a holding pattern. There's always pattern. There's impure pattern of sentient beings in our game making, our languaging, our worlding, or our dreaming. And then there's the awakened way of patterning. It's called pure relative truth. How like if you abide in awareness as deity, as wisdom being, and you allow that like rigpa, or that like pristine valid cognition, the yogic direct pristine self-reflexive valid cognition to arise as shape and form, as a relative expression, like then you get sacred world, sacred sound, you get deity and mantra, you get mandala that actually has wisdom awareness. So that's called the union of space and wisdom, or this, three Vajra state, pure body, pure speech, pure mind. At that point, it's no longer doing fictitious games at all. It's not using duality sentience as if it believes in any of these games as being really games. It's just pure relative display. How do the five wisdoms display themselves purely without being filtered through duality frameworks? And they can see the nightmares of duality game making, duality dreaming, duality nightmaring, but they don't believe in any of it, so they can like skillfully, elegantly engage with it, with the host of us, the six classes of beings, who are like actually lost in those dreams because we are assuming them as being given realities, ontologically real. There's no other way it could be. These Bhumi Bodhisattvas and enlightened Buddhas, they no longer make that mistaken assumption. There's infinitely could be in all these games. There's so many ways to do, there's infinite ways to do coherent games, patterns, worlds, bodies. And they can play those games, and they do that with skill, like skillfully. That's the path of Vajrayana, skillful means, and used in union with wisdom, seeing this dreamlike nature. It's all just like natural awareness expressing in a variety of ways. And then they play those games. So this is such a vast invitation to be this vast and profound as like a default mode of being a Sutra Mahayana practitioner, Tantra Mahayana practitioner, of a Theravada practitioner, of a Dzogchen practitioner. It's not just, Buddhism isn't just the rational, empirical only scientific logic. It has that. But it doesn't only have to be that way. The Buddha taught so much more than that too. And so we should just know that. Buddhism isn't just a set of techniques that we can apply into our myth of the given, the world as we see it being true. We can do it that way, but that's actually like how a baby does it. And so we can do it immaturely like that and think we're either, it's just my way, or like this is the enlightened, next, more evolved way, or whatever. But it's actually, from the larger view of Buddhism, a very immature thing to do, because it's so extractive, because it's so one note homogenizing, rational only, one logical system only. It's like so kind of blatantly extreme. And so this is kind of an invitation to like be this open-minded and precise, to entertain the possibility there are more than human beings. This was taught in all the levels and layers of Buddhist teaching. It wasn't just some provisional teaching to get to the main essential meaning, which was only absolute truth, because in the higher teachings, there's a union of relative and absolute truth. And emptiness always embodies, it always has a relational shaping or responsiveness, as semi-form and form. These are just like core Buddhist truths that like there's always going to be worlding, there's always going to be bodies, there's always going to be the like essential importance of context as the living relational dynamic, like that is what is open dimension. Like it always is, the Dharma Dhatu always is a field of awareness, and the awareness always has a field. It's not ever just purely transcendent as like just first principles and just like get the essence and plug it in wherever you want, and all the matter, the main thing is just you have the essence, you know. It's always internested systems of bodies in worlds. That's always been essential in Buddhism. And especially if we're going to live Buddhism as an art, as a philosophy, as a religion, a way of collective sense making, as culture, like this more mature way, this more fully embodied, more layered, nuanced way of like practicing Buddhism as multiple Buddhisms, as like a larger coherent whole of these different kind of sets of yanas or vehicles that the Buddha taught, like with integrity in relation to one another. This is just core Tibetan Buddhist approach stuff. And so I've really questioned like how we can be following in the teachings of the Buddha if we're not willing to entertain the possibility of other beings, of more than human beings, Gandharvas and Rakshasas, and I mean just there's some Kimaras and Nagas and all the formless gods. I mean there's just so many other beings, and just there's so many teachings on all that. The Jataka tale. I mean, there's so much to just reduce all that to metaphor. This is all just like just psychology only is the main point of Buddhism. It's just such this flattened, emaciated, like streamlined, homogenized version of Buddhism that's just so sad. And it's still 10% happier it can do that. But it's just this very narrow slice of what the Buddha taught. And to believe that's the pure teaching or the original teaching or the like true teaching for more evolved, mature people is just such a sad mistake to make. And I'm sorry. I just feel bad for beings that make that mistake, because like how are they living Buddhism as opposed to just living a set of techniques where they just like plug the Buddhist techniques into their life and kind of just do whatever else they want in their life. That's not an Eightfold Noble Path. we're like amazingly rich beings, like participating in this incredibly dynamic, systems of systems of systems, like these ecologies that we're a part of, that are in our bodies, that make up our belief structures, that like are like literally all the different parts and aspects of the worlds that we're a part of. And to learn to like play these different games and in different bodies with different shapes and sizes and forms and features and colors and languages, like just how beautiful to have like actual coherent paths of practice and study that do that. Like that is Tibetan Buddhism. That is Sutra Mahayana Buddhism. That is Theravada Buddhism. They all have that. Like the dynamic richness of what the Buddha taught and how it fits together into these larger wholes of study and practice. It's just utterly genius. And I just trust in the Buddha way more than I trust in Einstein or. I mean, if you believe Buddhism, like if you believe some of the Buddha's teachings, enlightenment's possible. And during his life, he like upended the caste system without threatening like local kings and queens. Like he actually got sponsorship from them. And he taught Buddhism as a practical reality and like as this community way of living. And it's this deep philosophical structure and these like multimodal ways of enacting like this transformative practice to tame your mind and like do no harm and help beings creatively, skillfully. That the Buddha did so much more than just E equals MC squared, which is amazing. And he condensed it into these dense, like highly nutritious, compressed packets of pith instruction information that we can do in these single session things that bring all the essential points together in these nuanced, elegant, just lovely, actionable ways. I mean, such genius, such like extraordinarily like amazing capacity. He didn't just teach us how to wake up, He taught us how to like live too. How to like live the dreams and be in the dreams and move between dreams and games and worlds. I mean, Buddha taught so much more than just like be here now. I mean, how do you live in situations and civilizations and build things together and create art together and ritual to like have a full spectrum experience of mind, of awareness, of body embodiment. Like homage to the noble ones, the Buddha and Guru Rinpoche and all these noble lineage masters that have this full spectrum approach of Buddhisms enfolded into this rich set of like inexhaustible practice methods and study insights that can bring immediate direct benefit for ourselves and others now and long into the future. Like they're systems that help us hold the ontological flood, the amount of the perspectives and that are like the amount of truth. Like they give us the actual like ways to like stretch ourselves and relax and loosen our openness of mind and body so we can handle this much complexity, this much fullness, step by step, in a paced way, with just delight and rigor and verifiability and trust. Like trusting like that this immediate steps we can do them, and it builds up our trust to like like actually go further, to explore out of our box more in depth, to like really like be willing to upend some of the rigidity of our belief structure. Maybe Paul Rinpoche, in words of my perfect teacher, maybe he was actually pointing to realms and beings in realms, in the hell realms, in the formless God realms. They weren't just like psychological projection metaphors. They're actual beings in worlds. Yes, they're just empty, just like the human realm. They're just dreamlike. But like once we gotta fixate on that world framing, like we experience it as if it's really real. And then to give the techniques to like undo that extra false mistaken assumption, the really realness of it all, the ontological rigidity that like fights against the plurality of perspectives, but to like soften that and to smoothen it and clarify so we can elegantly move between different ontological positions, between different ways of being and knowing and enacting, of becoming. And the Buddha taught these as like patterned, coherent systems, philosophies, and practice paths. Like how it's so rich and amazing. I'm like really so inspired and encouraged. So, I mean, just some casual reflections, honestly, on a topic that's actually kind of very near and dear to me. The like full on the multiplicity of worlds and beings. And like that, like allowing for that richness to be a part of your practice and your study. It opens so many doors. It brings in so much fresh air. But to do it rigorously, not just anything goes, but actually like carefully follow the teachings of the Buddha and these great lineage masters to explore with nuance and thorough rigor. But to do it in a really open dimensional, open-minded, open-hearted way. It's like just like following in the footsteps of the Buddha. It's what the Buddha taught. And even if we don't believe the Buddha taught all of this, the 9 yanas, then the current Vajrayana masters definitely do. In Nyingma school, they teach this. So we're at least following in these great footsteps of His Holiness Dalai Lama, His Holiness Sakya Trizin, His Holiness Penna Rinpoche, His Holiness like Tenli Norbu Rinpoche, and I mean His Holiness like Trungam Trungpa Rinpoche, and Dzogchen Khensa Rinpoche, and Venerable Kempo Rinpoches, and just so many great yogis and yoginis and these masters, Machik Labdran, just so many beings that are teaching this internested, layered approach to the multiplicity of Buddhist worldview, Buddhist teachings, Buddhist views, meditations, conduct, and fruition. Homage to the noble ones. Hope it's helpful. Hope it inspires a little more open-hearted, open-mindedness. A little bit of like, maybe to not be so comfortable with like my way of set fixed assumptions is the right way. Maybe there are some other worlds happening. There are some other beings happening. And like if I develop my own wisdom and compassion, I can learn to inhabit and be with them more skillfully, not just strawman them as being like these fake representations that are easy to logically refute, but to like really, steelman them into like actual valid, coherent dreams, worlds, positions, philosophies. And then to beyond that, platinum man, like really try to inhabit them with like Tonglen, to take on their perspective, to take on their suffering, to like offer like your own nutritious happiness in a way that's not demeaning. It's not like I'm privileging mine and at the expense of others. It's like really allowing the fullness of someone else's world to shape your world, so you can really be with them and like really co-create together as Sangha. Thank you, friends. By this merit may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. The precious bodhicitta, and those without it, may it be generated. And those who have it, may it never diminish, but always continue increasing. Deity, mantra, and dharmakaya are the nature of appearance, sound, and awareness, the pervasive kaya and wisdom display of the Buddhas. May practitioners of the profound, secret great perfection remain inseparable from the innermost, one taste awareness of wisdom mind.